Well, thank you, Father, for that introduction, and thank all of you for coming this evening. It's quite strange after 18 months of being locked in a studio and only addressing pixels to suddenly address real people, and it's a great joy to do that. So thank you for making the effort to come. There's with perfume has always been a great favorite of painters. It comes in all four of the Gospels. But in fact, there are two stories. In Luke, it's the story of the woman of bad repute, and it happens in Galilee. But in Matthew, Mark, and John, it's a story that happens in Bethany just a few days before the Last Supper. But what the two stories have in common, like the spikenard that filled the whole house with fragrance, is the deep sense of shocked embarrassment felt by the men who were present there at this very emotional demonstration. In Matthew and Mark, it just says that the perfume was poured over Jesus' head. But in Luke, the woman weeps over his feet and kisses his feet and then pours perfume over them and wipes them with her hair. And in John, the woman who John actually identifies as being Mary, the brother of the sister of Martha and Lazarus, does the same and pours the perfume over his feet and wipes it with her hair. In Luke's gospel, the embarrassment of the guest is felt as turns into a sort of criticism of Jesus. How could he not know who this woman was that doing this? But in the Bethany incident, the shock takes the form of indignation against the wastefulness. Why this waste? They asked him. John attributes this just to Judas. Mark includes some of those present. But Matthew admits it was the disciples generally who started making hasty, back-of-the-envelope calculations. Must have been at least 300 denarii, whole year's wages. It could have been sold for the poor. Why wasn't it sold? These kind of critical calculations must certainly have embarrassed Mary, and Jesus' first response is quite sharp. Stop bothering her. You always have the poor with you. You can help them any time. But when he justifies her action, he does it not in terms of its pragmatic effectiveness, but in terms of its beauty. She has done something beautiful for me. In Greek, kalon. Today we like to justify actions by their measurable outcomes. We look for outputs we can quantify, for evidence-based interventions which we can put numbers to. And that's fine, there's certainly a place for that. But Jesus here is pointing not to a quantity that can be counted, but to a quality that must be discerned and will be discerned, he says, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world. And it's really the connection between those two things, the discernment of beauty and the preaching of the gospel that I want to talk about this evening. When Father Alexander first invited me to speak at the dedication of these windows, after the dedication of these windows, I didn't really think I could. I hadn't seen the windows. I didn't know anything about St. Patrick's. And in the circumstances of lockdown, I couldn't easily remedy my ignorance. However, he said that rather than speaking directly about the windows, I could perhaps provide a context for them. And so that's what I'm going to try to do this evening. At the end of this talk, I will say a very little about the windows, and I'll invite you to turn and look at them again, and hopefully you might be able to see them in a slightly wider context. And the context that I'm inviting you to look at them in is what I've called the redress of beauty. And by the time I finish, I hope you and I hope I will have some idea of what I meant when I gave myself this rather mysterious title. To talk about beauty today is somewhat countercultural. Not only because qualities that can't be enumerated and quantified can seem unreal, but also because even within the realm of the arts, the idea of beauty has for more than a century now been regarded with suspicion, if not disdain. The Barbican Centre is at the moment hosting an exhibition of the work of Jean Dubuffet, who expressed this more forcibly than most. In a lecture to the Arts Club of Chicago in 1951, Dubuffet argued that what he describes as the Greek notion of beauty, that certain objects are more beautiful than others, is a meager and not very ingenious invention. The usual notion of beauty, he says, is completely false. Creating shapes and colours for the supposed delight of the eye was utter flim-flam, which he wouldn't waste his time on. The myth of plastic beauty was, in his opinion, an imposter. Now, in speaking like this, Dubuffet, and I don't want to be unfair to him, because he was wanting to promote his own idea of beauty rather than get rid of everything altogether. But and his idea was what he called art brut, raw art. The idea that painting allows a way of expressing our inner voices, and is a language, an instrument of knowledge and expression. And by 1951, this idea, or very similar ideas, had been around for quite a while. At the beginning of the 20th century, artists were all attempting to discover a new kind of beauty appropriate to the modern machine age. But an aspect of that was a kind of year zero approach to past ideas of beauty. The impact of these ideas was not actually felt hugely throughout the general populace in terms of art, because people could ignore art galleries and new art exhibitions. But it was felt, I think, very clearly in the realm of architecture, because that can't be ignored, because we live in it. And one of the people who captured, I think best, the impact of the year zero approach was the cartoonist Osbert Lancaster, who in 1949, just 2 years before Dubuffet's lecture, produced a little book called Drainfleet Revealed. Drainfleet was an imaginary, this describes the architectural history of an imaginary English market town. And he produced a series of drawings, the first of which is Roman Drainfleet. At the back, you'll have some difficulty seeing that, but right in the far right-hand corner is a one-legged beggar who recurs in all of the drawings, rather echoing Christ's statement that the poor are always with us. But anyway, he went on to Norman Drainfleet, 15th century Drainfleet, 17th century Drainfleet, 19th century Drainfleet, and finally, the most shocking image, but actually in no way unrealistic, is 20th century Drainfleet in 1949. You will notice on the well, if those of you who are near enough will have noticed, there's an abbey gate on the far right, which was apparently, he calls Abbot Bloodworth's lodgings, which in this image, where the whole sort of architectural unity of the town has been lost, where the buildings are covered with shop fronts and advertisements and entirely given over to traffic. And there was a little statue of Abbot Bloodworth on the Abbey Gate, which has now been replaced by traffic lights. And he then gives one final image, which the planners then try and cope with this traffic problem by redesigning the whole of Drainfleet and into a kind of new Milton Keynes with Abbot Bloodworth's lodgings stranded on a traffic roundabout in the middle. That even more poignantly, he produced a series of drawings that traced the history of a little building called Poets' Corner, which the Earl of Littlehampton, who are his characters who appeared in Lancaster's Daily Express cartoons, he imagined them having given this little lodge to their pet poet, Jeremy Tipple, who you can see declaiming in his garden. And he then sort of traces the history of this little cottage, again through the 19th century, and right up into the as it sort of goes down here, right up into the 20th century. And this allows it, he also imagines that it's the whole successors of Tipple poets who live there, which he then produces wonderful parodies of English verse to go alongside this, including what I think is the best parody of T.S. Eliot I've ever come across. And the final poet is one of the 30s poets who produces a poem wonderfully entitled Crack Up in Barcelona. The final image, though, is, as I say, becomes almost a metaphor. The Poets' Corner is about to be demolished, and it becomes a sort of metaphor of the marginalization of poetry and beauty. That almost inevitably seems to follow from the denial that there is a thing of such a thing as beauty. Of course, the process of what Shelley called uglification has more than one cause. New technologies, industrial capitalism, growing populations have all played a role in a process that began in the 19th century. and which fell much more heavily on the poor than on the rich. One of the bleakest illustrations from another of Lancaster's architectural books, Pillar to Post, is called Salubrious Dwellings for the Industrious Artisan. While Ruskin and William Morris both regarded industrial capitalism as the root cause of uglification, Gerard Manley Hopkins, who was writing at the same time as them, saw within this a deeper cause, going back, if you like, to the fall. So that while he saw the world as charged with the grandeur of God that flames out like shook foil, but, he says, generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge, and shares man's smell. For all three of these writers, the human need and longing for beauty was a given, something to which needed to cut the ground from under that approach, and left any appeal or even mention of beauty sounding like sort of political reaction. So that whereas Ruskin and William Morris, when they argued against industrial uglification, were hailed as political revolutionaries, when the late Roger Scruton, who in this respect argued in a very similar way, was appointed to the government's Building Beautiful Commission, it provoked a hostile debate in Parliament. Now, although I do in fact agree with quite a bit of what Dubuffet wrote about painting, expressing our inner voices, I think that what I've described as the year zero approach of early modernism, the idea that the Greek notion of beauty, that certain objects are more beautiful than others, the idea that that is just an invention and completely false, is itself completely false. And to make my case, I'm going to show you 4 exhibits.